Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to our second of 3 panels where we, in partnership with Northwell Health, are speaking with some of the top leaders in the sports industry. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our guest for this executive panel. I'll start by welcoming Carlson, who is the SVP of Revenue and Strategy for the Philadelphia Eagles, where she recently played an integral part in making the Eagles the first esports tournament provider in the NFL. Catherine, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Really excited to be here today.
And we're also excited to have Ishwara Glassman Chrein. She's with us. She is the head of sports partnership at Verizon Media and Yahoo Sports. She was named to the Sports Business Journal 40 Under 40 class of 2020. Ishwara, such a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
And also named to that Sports Business Journal 40 Under 40, Zaileen Janmohamed. Zaileen is the head of partnership development and innovation for the LA 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Zaileen, we so appreciate you being here.
Happy to be here, Miriam.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the benefits of these video calls, right, is that we are all able to do this because getting you guys together for an in-person event with your schedules would be near to impossible. We have a lot of stuff to talk about. I say we get to it. I say let's start with COVID-19, the thing that brought us all onto these video calls. Parts of the sports world went on pause this year because of the pandemic. I think everyone learned a lot during that time and is learning a lot still. Catherine, I want to start with you, though. In what ways has COVID-19 either reframed or maybe reinforced what sports really mean to fans and consumers?
Yeah, I think what COVID reinforced for me is our reliance on face-to-face meetings, face-to-face fan engagements and events, and then also our game days, that was such a part of the sports tradition. So for us, it was a massive transition going from stadiums full of 70,000 fans and doing up to 250 events a year to having, 3 games this year that we had fans. And at that, it was limited, to 5,500 fans. So that was just such a change of course throughout the season. And what I discovered is that the desire for live sporting events is really strong. And we also discovered that our fans were just hungry for more content. So they couldn't get it through the players on the field, but they wanted it through other avenues, whether that was digital, social, however they could get it. And I think there was a point early in the spring where we just had no sports were being played across the globe, which is just such an anomaly. I think it's a once in a lifetime, turn of events. And then all of a sudden we had the draft, the NFL draft. I think it was late April in 2020. And what was interesting to me, and this led to my thought, people are just craving anything to do with sports, is we had to flip a whole NFL draft to becoming virtual.
Right.
And it was really interesting and really well done because over 15 million people tuned in that Thursday night, up 37% from the previous year. So it really was interesting because fans actually really enjoyed it because you were seeing where your coach or GM's house looked like or where the players and their families. So it actually became really engaging content. And so, I think it was an interesting way reinforcing our fans' desire to really get back to sports. And, I think as the season, even though we didn't always have fans in our stadiums, the NFL presence on TV was strong. If you look at the rankings, 24 of the 25 top shows on TV were actually NFL games. So it really spoke to the fact that our fans were really craving sports. They couldn't get to a stadium, but they were watching it on television. So I think it reinforced the fact that sports is here to stay, and our fans just love it, whether they're at the stadium or not. They'll figure out other ways to engage and with your brand, with your team, with your venue. So that's the spiel.
Yeah, that draft, one very memorable moment for me includes a dog sitting at the table. I think we all know what I'm referring to. Now, Zaileen, you've spoken about how the Olympics are really special because everyone rallies behind their country. It's not just about the sport, it's about their country doing well, and that brings everyone together. I wonder, kind of in line with what Catherine was saying, does that extend beyond the Olympics to just, kind of our everyday professional sports?
Yeah, I mean, I think when a fan has avidity towards something, whether that's their country or their team, it is strong. And sport brings about this passion that is typically unmatched with other passion areas in your life. For the most part, I think Catherine's answer was spot on. I think, if this question is about reframing or reinforce, the reframing for me has been in the area of the changes in broadcast. I mean, we experienced it here just in this session, right? How different production teams have to be and how agile they have to be to kind of deal with different situations. I think broadcasting is going to be probably the industry that we see the most change in because they've had to be really nimble and really efficient in how they develop content. I think content has changed. The way I consume sports today is very different than how I consumed a year ago. And so that reframing has actually been really good to see. And I expect that to change. I think the reinforcing is to Catherine's point, like I miss sport. I miss going to a game. I miss having family and friends over watching a game in my house. I miss all the things that go around with that, the trash talking and the yelling and the throwing the football outside and whatever your family or your friend circle does. And so, I think as much as content has changed that, and you're getting different types of content fed to you that appeal to your curiosity in, different senses, there is nothing that replaces the experience of watching a game either live or in your house with people around you. And so I'm excited for that to return, even though it might change a little bit. I can't wait.
Yeah, Ishwara, so Zaileen just mentioned how, in particular, broadcast, for example, has really had to adjust how they do things. How have you adjusted your business operations approach over, the past year of the pandemic?
Yeah, for sure. I guess, first of all, it makes me really lucky to work in sports. I really do miss going to live events, and we're all fortunate to work in sports. I think the one thing it's important to remember is that 99% of fans actually don't go to games in person. I mean, we're all really fortunate that we work in sports and probably get to go to more than our fair share of them. And it's wonderful, and it's the lifeblood of the industry, and a lot of jobs depend on it. But most people consume sports by watching on TV or their phone. And so, but to Zaileen's point, a lot of people do that socially. Like I have a lot of my colleagues, March Madness and brackets are big for us, would have definitely spent most of this weekend and probably, in all honesty, some of, the days and work days at a bar with their friends, So that's something people miss, even though many of them wouldn't have gone to Indianapolis or San Antonio in person, they missed that. So, as Verizon, we actually, I don't know that we changed our priorities a lot, but we did, some things did happen faster. So, as Catherine mentioned, the NFL did have a good season this year. We broadcast all those NFL games, but we changed them this year so that you could watch with your friends. We called it Watch Together. So I got to watch a Chargers game with my dad, who sits 3,000 miles away, but we could see each other and chat while we watched the game. And then, as we announced last week, we are launching a new product called Draft Together, where you're going to be able to draft your teams while video conferencing. I mean, one of the most fun times for those who play fantasy football or hockey or baseball or basketball is the draft. And most people like to do it in person. And maybe we can't do it right now in person, but it'd be more fun to be able to see and talk to your friends when they steal your favorite player.
Well, so here's the $1 million question, I feel like. Zaileen, I'm going to go to you for it. Sports after this looks different. How? Because I think something that we've heard from experts is the pandemic will end. COVID necessarily won't go away, but we've learned so much. So how does that adjust the future of sports?
Yeah, I think there's so many different ways to answer this question. Let me try, Miriam, to hit a couple.
Yeah, that's why it's $1 million one.
I know. So from a business side, right, in the area that I work around partnerships and sponsorships, and Ishwara will probably kind of feel what I'm saying. I think the way that brands engage with properties in terms of what their contracts look like these days is going to change. Terms and conditions of sponsorship contracts will change to account for things like this that probably were never even thought of before or contemplated before. And so, our legal teams are kind of working through what does that look like? How do we protect the brands that are associated with us? And how do you kind of foresee things that happen in the future that you didn't even know existed a year ago? So I think there's some things there on the business side that are going to be really interesting to see. I think from a fan perspective, from the ones that sit at home, so the 99% that are not at the games at an event, I think it's going to be an enhanced experience for them. I think there are certain industries that have accelerated because of COVID. And I think how fans consume content and what they get to see, either from a VR, AR, statistical, analytical perspective, has all changed, and fans are going to be better for it. I think the fans that attend games, that experience is going to change as well. I'm actually really interested to see what happens there on how you protect fan safety and what different venues do to account for that. Because to your point, while people may get vaccinated, the pandemic, is not over technically, right? So there will be a different experience for fans as they enter and consume a sport in stadium and in venue.
And Catherine, how about from the team side? Sports after this looks different. How?
Well, I think it's the silver lining of COVID is that I think it led to the acceleration of many innovative and creative business solutions. So, like, for example, we were pretty much a stadium that was close to 100% mobile ticketing, but in our 3 games that we had fans, we were 100% mobile. And then we were all talking about going cashless, but COVID accelerated that. We probably would have done it over a phased in, maybe 2 or 3 year approach. We did it in less than 3 months. And so I like the innovation actually helped accelerate certain things, especially when it came to technology and safety. So I agree with Zaileen on our business deals look very different. A lot of things we never contemplated. I think from a team perspective, we contemplated cancelled games. We contemplated games not being played because of work stoppage or labor challenges. But we just never anticipated playing games without fans. So we've been very transparent and over communicating and flexible with all our partners to figure out what's the solution, because we didn't have a solution laid out in front of us. And so to me, those 3 things were so critical going forward, I think will be critical. But I think the number one thing to get fans back in the stadiums at full capacity is just safety. And I think that's the one area where we invested a lot of time and resources in, working with a consultant. We literally came up with an 80-page game plan, if you will, to open up safely. And it covered every single concept, from communications to fans to how we blocked off seats, what our policy was in terms of pods sitting together, how many people we could safely have in a suite, the ingress, egress, no tailgate. It was an incredible document, but we felt really great going into it. And I feel like going through that exercise sets us up for success for the season 2021. So I think it's going to look different, but I think I see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I feel somewhat cautiously optimistic that we may not get back to 100% like life before COVID, but I do think we'll have plans in place to make it safe for our fans, and we'll get back to life as normal.
Well, I recently heard someone say, good leadership really shines through in difficult times. Ishwara, that was you. I heard you say that in an interview recently. And just on the topic of leadership, Catherine, you bring up silver linings. I think one of them being we have seen good leadership shine through. We have seen how important that is. Ishwara, I wonder how you identify leaders on your teams. What characteristics do you look for when you're either looking to hire someone or promote someone for your team?
Yeah, first from the industry perspective, I would say that COVID has actually really strengthened the partnerships that we have. I sit on the other side of partnerships from Zaileen and Catherine, negotiating on the brand side. And COVID was a difficult situation for many of our partners. And we recognize that, and it wasn't anybody's fault. And it's difficult, right? Hosting fans in person, no matter how great the digital experiences are, it's just not as great as hosting people in person. Like it's just very hard to make the assets as valuable when there's no one in the stands and we can't bring, our customers. but it really shows the power of relationships and leaderships that you can work through it and continue to build trust. But from a hiring perspective, I always say that I look for three things. I look for people who are really smart, people who are hardworking and have a good attitude, and someone I can hang out with. Like, we all work in sports, so we spend a lot of time, getting delayed at airports together, sitting through games together. And, before COVID, I definitely spent more time with my colleagues than I did with my family. So it really matters if you like one another and trust one another. I figured the rest I can teach you. I can teach you the sports industry. I can teach you how to negotiate a deal, but I really can't teach, intelligence or good attitude or integrity or, drive. I want people who want to be here. We're really lucky to work in sports. And unfortunately, being a sports fan is not enough to work in sports. I mean, it's necessary, but not sufficient. The sports business is more than just being a sports fan. And we're still a business, right? We still have accountants and lawyers and HR people and deal people. And we're really lucky to do this. So I want people who want to be here with me because it's hard work. It's fun, but it's still hard work.
Zaileen and Catherine, you both shook your head when she said being a sports fan isn't enough for you to be able to work in sports. Zaileen, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, no, I shook my head because I still, Ishwara, hear it when I interview people like, why are you here? Well, I love sports. I'm like, so do I. I get that, but what else? And so, it's so much more than that. This is a hard industry to be in. The hours are long. The problems that the industry is trying to solve right now are different and hard. And, you have to be really committed to solving those problems. I look for a couple things when I'm looking for leadership specifically in people that I'm either promoting or hiring. I look for people that I think can lead from the front and the back, both of those things. So people who can set vision and see what the path looks like forward, but also don't mind doing the work. I want both those characteristics in the person that I'm looking to promote. I want someone who knows the rules of kindergarten, be kind, to share, to be humble. Like, all of those things are really important in a leader. And it's the things that I read on my son's board when I used to drop him off to school, right? Those are intrinsic characteristics that are really, really important. And then I look for someone who isn't scared of a big, hairy problem. Like, I look for those people that, are not just great executionally, but can look at a problem that I give them or take a situation that's maybe a little bit gray and not black and white and say, let me see if I can figure that out. And it doesn't scare them. And so, because leaders, like, you're not going to get something that is just, here's your math question and here's the math answer, right? Here is this really complicated thing that we have to solve, like, go solve it. And so I'm looking for people who, are curious and to have an ability to do that type of work.
So I want to kind of bridge these two conversations together, the challenges that we've faced during COVID, and then what they look like moving forward in sports with good leaders like the three of you. What are the biggest challenges? And we've kind of touched on it roughly, but what are the biggest challenges facing sports in the next 12 months? And Zaileen, I know that's kind of a different question for you, given you're planning for 2028, right? So, but what does the next 12 months look like for you?
Yeah, from an LA 28 perspective, let's talk about those games first. And I don't know if this is a problem, but these are the things we're trying to solve, right? We have 7 years now to build a really great games in LA. And our goal in that journey is, because we have 7 years, which is more than any other organizing committee has had. And we are doing this in LA, which already has great sports venues, sports and entertainment venues. How do you make sure the games are great, but also make sure that that's just table stakes for you? How do you do more than just building a games? How do you use the Olympic and Paralympic movement to change some of the things in this country that need to be changed? And so I'm talking about things like sustainability and climate change. I'm talking about things like diversity, equality, and inclusion. I'm talking about things like our education system. I'm talking about revitalizing arts and culture. And so those are the types of things that we as an organizing committee are really looking at problems to solve in the next 12 months and then beyond, and getting partners along with us to really drive that change. The other thing that we are looking really hard at with our partners at the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee is just more and better support of our athletes. It's a problem that was highlighted and heightened by COVID, but the stat I would give you is 60% of Team USA makes less than $25,000 a year. And so just think about that in your head, that the best athletes that represent this country are making $25K, which is not sustainable. And so, a lot of us across both the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee and USOP and LA28 are thinking through how do we better support our athletes who are, they're the engine of the movement in this country. We have to make sure that they're okay. And so those are a couple things that we're working on from an LA28 perspective. I think broader than that and very personal to me, because I have two boys that are 7 and 10, like I've watched COVID and the impact on them socially from school, et cetera. But I'm curious and really worried about the impact to youth sport just in general. And I'm hoping, especially in this country where we need kids to be out to play and playing, that we can pick up and start to move forward to get a lot of our young people out and playing sports, whether that's club or just recreationally. It needs to happen quickly.
The conversations that Zaileen's having for LA28, Ishwara, are these similar conversations that you guys are having at Verizon over the next, 12 months, what those look like?
Yeah, I mean, for us, the problem and question is still the same. How do you give fans what they really want? I mean, I always think that, we build products and we build technology at Verizon. So really you want to come at it from, hey, how could I make my experience better, both in the stadium or at home? And, the first thing you want when you're at a stadium or arena is you actually would like your phone to work, right? You'd like the Wi-Fi, you'd like to be able to post to social media, you'd like to be able to text your friends and see what they want at the food cart. So, but then how do you make the experience even better than that? Like last year at the Super Bowl, we did a multicam app so you could see the game from different perspectives. And then, what do I want when I'm at home? Well, what I really want when I'm at home is I want the game presented in a way that's interesting to me. Like I see the future being, an NFL game, or we did a bet stream with the NBA. So you could watch the regular NBA game just as it's produced, or you could watch a bet stream if you're interested in betting on the game, or one day maybe you could watch a fantasy stream so you could see how your team's doing up and down with the points. I think for us, COVID's really taught us something we already knew, that fans are social. Sports is inherently social. It's definitely better if you can go to the game with your friends or watch at a bar with your friends or have them over for a Super Bowl party. But how do you make the experience social even at home is something we're trying to figure out.
So we know the questions, right? We know the challenges. I wonder, what are the trends that all three of you are eyeing? And I wonder, because you guys do work in similar, kind of facets of the industry, but different. So I wonder where they intersect. So Catherine, let's start with you. What trends are you watching?
Yeah, I think one of the trends, which is obviously growing in the US and has continued to evolve over the past 2 years, is really in the legalized sports betting space. Originally coming from Australia, it's a more advanced industry here and in Europe than in Europe and Australia. So I think that category is just going to continue to evolve, and we've taken a cautious approach in the NFL. Talking about this about 2 years ago, and I think there were 4 key objectives that the NFL was really trying to achieve, as they dip their toe into the sportsbook world. And I think one of the most important ones, and I think it's important for brands and properties, is just protecting the integrity of the game. And then the second one is really maintaining our brand reputation, so making sure that we're continuing to not do any damage around that. And then driving fan engagement. The reality is, whether we like it or not, betting and fantasy sports and your March Madness bracket, it gets you engaged. You're more engaged in the sport because of this category. And then the final one, which was really where my role comes in, is how do you grow commercial opportunities around that? We have some restrictions in place at the NFL, but if I had a crystal ball, I think that eventually the USA will catch up with the rest of the world in the sports betting arena. And, I think there'll be some consolidation of brands, but I think ultimately there'll be incremental opportunities in the NFL, and it'll continue to open up the industry. And that'll bring a lot of other industries along for the ride as well. So whether it's technology companies, whether it's media companies, whether it's Verizon, I mean, you name it, that there's so many different brands that there'll be a lot of synergistic opportunities. So I definitely see this space as a growing area, and that trend, I think, as more states become legal in this space, you'll continue to see this grow and grow. So that's what I'll be keeping my eye on in the next 12 months, is one of the things I'll be keeping my eye on.
Ishwara, sports betting, that has to intersect with you.
Sure. I mean, absolutely. I think we've done a lot around, March Madness and brackets and all of that. I think, for me personally, my favorite thing about COVID has been the insights into the athletes' lives. Like, you saw the video of Kendall Coyne Schofield, squatting her husband, who's an NFL lineman. You saw the WNBA players with their children in the Wubble. You saw the NHL posted these really great videos of players coming home after, quarantining and getting to see their kids jumping into their arms. I actually think that's what fans have really been missing and love. I think it's been great for the athletes and the fans to be able to connect directly to one another. And I think that's something that COVID has enabled. The one other trend that I think is really interesting that we've seen a ton of news on in the past few days is the big deals that the NHL and the NFL just did with all of the broadcasters. And I think, that's certainly great for the leagues. I think in particular for the NHL, I think it'll mean more exposure and more money, which is good for the athletes as well. From the other side, as someone who pays for a lot of these rights, I think I continue to think about, how are they going to monetize these? How is this going to work? I mean, if you're a broadcaster or a media broadcaster like us or like Amazon, how do you do it? Do you sell more advertising? Do you do a direct to consumer product like ESPN Plus? How does paying 50 to 100% more in rights fees pencil out? How do you make that work, especially when most people under the age of 30 don't pay for cable? So that's the trend. I mean, it's been going on for a while, but this was the first time I saw two leagues do deals where there's a lot of streaming rights, two major leagues. So that'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the next 10 years.
And Zaileen, how about you? What are you looking at for the Olympics? Either the most recent or the most upcoming, or 28?
Yeah, no, I'm going to piggyback onto what Ishwara was saying. Is I'm looking at two different things. One really tied to broadcast and content and distribution, right? I think, now we have, with OTT, you have a variety of ways to access content, and most people within a certain demographic don't have cable. And so they're looking at access to content in very different ways. I met a founder of a startup here I'm in the Bay Area, in the Valley, and he was, building his own sports content platform that allowed fans to see their favorite sports personalities and talk to them and talk to them while they were watching a game, right? And get their perspective as a game was, streaming or being shown. And, you see that with Amazon and Twitch. You see, ways to access sport that are non-traditional so that fans can watch the sport, but with a perspective of a personality or a person that they like to hear and see and believe more authentically, right? And so I think that's just going to proliferate. I think this industry is going to just completely blow itself up, which makes these broadcast rights and the deals that were just signed even more oh my God, what is going to happen here? So that's one I'm watching really, really closely. The other one specific to the Olympic and Paralympic movement is just what happens with the NC2A and NIL. I think, this has the potential, right, to, in the US, go from a pool of athletes who are available for endorsement opportunities from 10,000 athletes or so, give or take, to 500,000. And so, this is going to, there's so many things to unpack there, but what that does to supply and demand of athletes, what that does to market pricing, how the NCAA will regulate what happens with all of their athletes from an endorsement perspective, how that impacts the athletes that come in and become members of Team USA. All of these things I'm kind of watching to see how they play out in the next little while.
Well, as we kind of come to a close of our conversation, we are nearing the end. Ishwara, you mentioned the human side of sports, and Zaileen, you mentioned, equity in the Olympics and Paralympics. That brings us to our kind of final topic here. And so the NHL has a great initiative. It's called Hockey is for Everyone, and it promotes the fact that no matter your race, religion, national origin, disability, gender, etc., the sport of hockey is for you. one of my favorite parts about sport is that I think that it's safe to say this concept extends far beyond hockey to all sports. So Zaileen, I want to start with you on this subject. You've spoken about how growing up, girls in your area didn't really play a lot of sports, but you loved sports, and hockey in particular. And so you would hide your skates and your stick so that you could play because you just loved the game. That experience, how do you think that's affected your career path?
Yeah, Miriam, I was born and raised in Vancouver, Canada. And so it's not that a lot of girls or people didn't play sport. It was more because I grew up as a very, in a very traditional Indian family. And within that family, right, and that structure and the culture that surrounded me, it wasn't normal for a girl to play sports and then want to play hockey. Like those two things did not work well with my mother at all. And so, I had to find a way. I knew I loved it. And so I had to find a way to play without really telling her that I was playing. I watched that movie when it came out, Bend It Like Beckham, and I was like, this is my movie. Like, this is my story right here. Someone figured it out. I had to do that for a few years until I think she realized how passionate I was about it. And, now I've made a career out of a passion for sport. I think that's done a couple things for me. I think, it's made me realize that if you want something bad enough, there's a way to go out and get it. And whether that's, I want to play hockey when I'm a kid, or whether I want to take a job that will allow me to stretch my brain and a lot of my other muscles, and maybe that I didn't think I was ready for it. I have this drive in me that's like, let me try. I want to try and do this. So I think it's just some of it is just inner growth. The other thing that it's done is allowed me to really be out there at this stage of my career, where I've been in here now for about 15 years or 20 years, and want to give back and find those people who are in the same situation of like, hey, can I do this? Can I play? Or can I be in this career? What if I'm not good enough? Like, I want to take those people, women or men otherwise, right? And say, hey, yeah, you can. It is possible to do. And so from those two perspectives, I think that's been a lot of growth for me. I think the last thing that I will end with is, as you progress down your career or through your career, you start to take jobs that align with your values more so than you did earlier on in your career. Earlier in your career, I think it's probably safe to say that it was a little bit more transactional. I took the job at LA28 because of the values that it had and enforced around diversity, around inclusion, around co-creation. Like, those things spoke to me, probably because of what I went through as a kid. And so, I think all of that experience has helped me get where I am today. I wouldn't trade it in. I do go back to my mom today, though, and I tell her a lot, like, see those women playing on the national team? Like, I could have been that person. And she kind of hangs her head a little bit, and she's like, but you love what you do. And I'm like, yes, I do. So there you go.
You could have been in the Olympics, but now you're helping plan the Olympics.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
And Ishwara, when Zaileen was saying you start to take jobs that align with your values more, you shook your head. What do you have to add there?
Yeah, and I would tell it from the perspective of a couple stories. One, I grew up watching sports with both of my parents, not just my dad. I went to baseball games with my dad, but my mom's a third-degree black belt. So, work at a company where people aren't surprised when you told them that you bought the UFC match last week and really enjoyed watching it, because men and women were fighting. And then last week I was watching a game with my husband and our son. We were watching a hockey game, actually, and my son tried to explain to me what offsides and icing was. And my husband and I both said to him, we were like, Matthew, your mother actually knows a lot about sports, so don't mansplain or actually boy-splain to her, what's going on in the hockey game. And, he backed off, but he learned something from that. Lastly, I will tell you, before I joined Verizon, after I joined Verizon, I actually spoke to my boss about it. I said, why did you hire me for this job? And I think this industry needs people with the courage of what he said. He goes, Ishwara, I really wanted to hire someone who wasn't a white male for this job. It was, head of BD and partnerships for Yahoo Sports. And he goes, and I interviewed a lot of people, and I couldn't find any diverse candidates who had done this exact job before. He goes, so I said to myself, maybe I need to find someone, sort of this best athlete strategy, who's done enough similar things and has the will and the drive and the intelligence and the desire to win, but hasn't done this exact job before. And that requires companies being willing to take a little bit of a risk, because if you only ever hire people who've done that exact same job at a different team or a different company, the way our sports industry looks will never change. And if we look at our fans, they're all sorts of diverse. And how can we possibly serve our fans well if we don't look and think and speak like them? It's not just, yes, of course, it's great to have diversity and inclusion policies and it's great PR, but it's really not just great PR. It has to become good business. It has to help us make more money.
Well, so I'm interested because you just said your boss who hired you said there was a lack of diversity, and you've spoken kind of candidly about how you didn't maybe even realize when you were younger that there was a sports industry for you to work in. You knew you could be an athlete. So where's the root of this, I'll call it a challenge, and what are steps forward we can take to make sure that everyone knows there's a sports industry for them to work in?
Yeah, no, I've always loved sports. I wasn't nearly as good of an athlete as some of you on here, but I played tons of sports growing up, and I always had a fierce desire to win, even if I wasn't, quite as talented as some of you may have been. But I didn't really realize you could work in sports. I worked in banking and management consulting, and then loved it, and then had the opportunity to work for a former McKinsey colleague of mine at IMG, which I spent a long time there and loved. But I think it comes down to a couple of things. You need to be able to see the diversity at the younger ranks. It's the same thing you saw when I was at McKinsey. There were tons of women at the analyst and associate level. And then you see women around the time that they often start to have children, and just the paths up become more and more difficult. And you've seen it a lot during COVID too. Like COVID has been particularly difficult on women and mothers. And I think we need to trust our employees to do their jobs and do it perhaps in a slightly different way. That's one of the things I've been working on as a leader, to be more empathetic and less judgmental and more understanding of the different ways that people work and can still be successful, and maybe even more successful, because it'd be better for everyone around me not to be just like me. I don't need to hire people who are just like me. What does that really accomplish? Hire people who come, like one of the guys who works for me is amazing because he is calm and patient and so much better at dealing with the accounting department at Verizon than I ever, yelling at accounting just never gets anything paid any faster,
Well, Catherine, you had kind of an interesting start in the beginning of your career. You worked for the Victorian Rugby League, and you were the absolute only woman in that organization when you started, correct? What was that experience like?
Well, it taught me to hang in there. I can tell you, even before I got into the rugby league, I did a sports management degree. And this rugby league job was my first foray into sports. But I'll never forget when I first started out in my sports management degree, there was a professor, and it sticks in my head some 30 years later. And I distinctly remember him saying in one of my first classes, he said, half of you in this room will have to work. Well, at first I didn't know who he was referring to. Surely he wasn't talking about me, but then I realized he was talking about the women in the office. So I would say it probably wasn't a great start in my journey in the sports industry. So when I took my first job at rugby league, I would tell you it was a lesson in perseverance. And so being the only woman in the entire organization, although admittedly there was only 5 of us in the office, so it was a fairly small state governing body, I needed to build credibility, because quite often I was questioned as the only woman in the office. Well, what does a woman know about rugby league? And so perseverance kicked in, and I was really determined to make a good impression. And so I actually decided to study up and get my rugby league coaching certification. So you may not realize from this that I'm a qualified rugby league coach, and I learned a lot about grassroots sports and that is, was my start in football, I guess. But I think it really taught me that, how do you build credibility? So you jump into a sport you may not know a lot about, or in the case of jump into a new job that you may not know about. That's okay. And how can you be a student of that industry? So I didn't know a lot about rugby league. So my way of building credibility within the office environment was to go out and get a coaching certification. And that was my way of working in, and I got street cred. The guys in the office like, oh yeah, she's a rugby league coach. And so it gave me a lot of credibility, but it made me realize that when you're looking at your career and paths in sports, it doesn't have to be linear, like a ladder. You don't just go up and I start in rugby league at the lowest entry level and I take a step up. What I found is the most exciting part of my career over the last 30 years is sometimes when I take the biggest risks and like take a sideward step and maybe get out of sports or do something that's maybe sports related and then jump back in, it actually, it exponentially, improved my career or prospects by jumping out. So I would say perseverance, risk-taking are probably the two things that I learned being the only woman in an organization. And it was the start of my career, which now I'm in the NFL. So it was kind of an interesting path to get here, probably very untraditional.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end this chat. Zaileen, Ishwara, Catherine, you are all incredibly busy. Thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
It was awesome to be here. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.